Thank you, Tadeusz, for this introduction. Thank you also to the National Library of Israel for organizing this series of lectures. I would like now to share my screen, and please, Tadeusz, if you could just confirm that this works. All right. I will work from the PDF.
Yes.
Okay. Is it okay full screen like this?
Yes.
You see?
Everything is perfect.
Okay, so let's start. I will have to switch from one folder to the other during my lecture, so I hope it will not bother you too much. And also, please forgive me if I read my paper. I'm not as fluent in English as I wish. So, A Church History Complete by Isaac Newton is first mentioned in Catherine Conduitt's Codicil to her will, dated 1737, which you have here transcribed. I will zoom in for you. It is listed among a series of divinity tracts that she wanted to get edited and published. Catherine was Newton's half-niece. She joined him when he moved from Cambridge to London and remained very close to him until his death. In 1727, the year Newton died, she became de facto in charge of all the many papers he left behind. With close friends of Newton, including her own husband, John Conduitt, who incidentally succeeded him at his office at the Royal Mint, they took upon themselves to order the vast amount of his manuscripts. One cannot overstate how difficult a task it was, and still is, to try to find a way in such chaotic archives. Despite many obstacles posed by the fragmentary nature and the dispersed state of the text they encountered, they managed to reconstruct and publish 2 books from the whole lot of Newton's papers. The first one is the Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended, published in 1728. The other is Observations upon the Prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse of St. John, published in 1733. Yet, Catherine did not want to stop there. Among other projects relating to natural philosophy, that is physics, alchemy, or history, that were available from Newton's archive, she ensured by her own testament that a specific set of theological works would be put to the press, so that, and here I quote her, so that the labor and sincere search of so good a Christian and so great a genius may not be lost to the world. Let's have a look at her will, which is transcribed here from the original kept in New College Library, Oxford. It is the image that you can see now on your screen. This document offers many interesting aspects for the custodial history of the manuscripts which form the object of our study. I will not enter into many details here. I will just call your attention to the fact that she nominated Arthur Ashley Sykes, here in red, which dates are 1684, 1756, to pursue the task of bringing Newton's theological works to light. Sykes was a trained theologian, a doctor of divinity, and a historian perfectly acquainted with Newton's work on such matters. Indeed, he published a lengthy and detailed apology of his Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended when the work came under attack in the 1740s. This is here, the title that he published. You see Isaac Newton's chronology mentioned here in the title page with the name of the author. Perhaps more importantly also, he did not hesitate to publicly defend, well, anonymously, sorry, defend heterodox theses on the Trinity, which were very similar to what Newton expressed in his manuscript. And here I think of another work from Dr. Sykes, published here, you see, under the anonymous name of author, clergyman in the country, but we know it is Dr. Sykes who published this modest plea. Published in 1718, so quite early in his career. Following this defense of Sykes, he was nominated by a committee of 6 members, which included Newton and Samuel Clarke, to the afternoon preachership at a new chapel set up in Newton's and Clarke's and the Conduit's London parish. So not only did Catherine know that Sykes was close to her uncle's religious ideas, but she also knew that Newton had approved of him very early on. In fact, after Samuel Clarke, who died in 1729, Sykes was probably the most suited scholar to accomplish this task. We will see later how much he proved this to be true. For now, let's keep in mind that Sykes did, at some point after Catherine's death in 1739, receive the papers mentioned in her will, and that he did pursue the task that was assigned to him, as shown by many traces of his interventions still visible throughout the manuscript. In fact, it seems that the reconstruction that resulted from his editorial work was left untouched from the time it was sent back to Newton's here until the 1936 Sotheby sale. It is at that point that the notion of a church history complete reappears in documents related to Newton's estate. You will find a reproduction of the 1936 auction catalogue, where manuscripts still in possession of Newton's heirs were listed for a sale. Under the number 249, James Cameron Taylor, the author of the catalogue, mentions Catherine Conduitt's Codicil to her will and a church history complete, followed by a series of chapter headings, as well as an estimate of its total length. From there, it becomes possible to get a more precise idea of which manuscripts exactly were gathered under that working title, and consequently to establish their current locations. Sotheby lot number 249 was purchased at the auction sale by one of the major booksellers present that day, Gabriel Wells. Later that year, the whole lot came into the hands of Jerusalem-born scholar Abraham Shalom Yehuda, 1877-1951, whom we have already been acquainted with in the previous lecture. It remains unclear at what point exactly did Yehuda buy it from Wells. Surely further exploration of Yehuda's archives held at the National Library of Israel will help answer that question, and many others that surround the immediate aftermath of that sale. Anyway, Yehuda kept lot 249 among his vast collection of Newton papers when he relocated to New York in 1940. It is from there that in January 1949, via another bookseller, William H. Schaap, he sold a very large part of the lot to the Swiss bibliophile and collector Martin Bodmer, 1899-1971, which you see here at probably the same time that he bought the manuscript. Here is a picture taken from his office at the Red Cross in Geneva, of which he was the vice president at that time. Today, it is widely accepted that what used to form Sotheby lot 249 at the 1936 sale consists almost entirely in 2 important sets of manuscripts. The Bodmer manuscripts, sometimes also referred to as of the church, held in Switzerland, and Yehuda manuscript 15, held in Jerusalem with the rest of Yehuda's collection. Oh, sorry. Here you have a picture of a portion of Yehuda manuscript 15. One way to confirm this is to have a look at the chapter headings listed in the auction catalog that I mentioned earlier, and to compare them with chapter headings found in these 2 manuscripts. Here are some examples of corresponding chapter headings. If I go back here, for example, we have two chapters delineated in red. The first one, chapter 10 of the Sanctuary of the Strength, or of the temple and synagogues of the Jews and churches of the Christian, mentioned in this descriptive notice of the catalogue, appears in the Bodmer manuscript at folio 262, which is here. You see the same chapter heading. The following chapter reading of the Sanctuary of Strength or of the Holy Covenant appears here in Yehuda manuscript 50. And both of these chapter headings are nowhere else to be found in Newton's paper. So it is important to notice that not only do chapter headings in the Bodmer manuscript and Yehuda manuscript 15 match the list established by Taylor, but that there are also numerous duplicates between these two manuscripts themselves, which confirm that they were at some point part of the same unit. In fact, it seems clear that Yehuda proceeded to take out what is now Yehuda manuscript 15 from Sosbilot 249 before he sold it to Martin Bodmer. The close relationship between the Bodmer manuscript and Yehuda manuscript 15 is rendered even more evident once one reads their content. Both clearly address the same themes in a similar fashion. In fact, Yehuda manuscript 15 is systematically presented in secondary literature as, I quote, a series of drafts of the Bodmer manuscript. Let's have a look at it first. Here is an image of Yehuda manuscript 15. Yehuda manuscript 15 consists in loose bifolios. Here you have one. That is a single sheet folded in half to make two leaves, for the most part, forming 193 folios in total. It is divided in 7 numbered subsections: Yehuda manuscript 15.1, 15.2, 15.3, and so on. Also, its foliation remains continuous throughout the whole lot. This division does not seem to correspond to any thematic change between subsections. Rather, Yehuda manuscript 15 can be presented as a simple juxtaposition of fragments relating to topics also covered by the Bodmer manuscript. Most of its pages are heavily corrected, often written upside down without delineated margin, as you can see here in another example from Yehuda manuscript 15. These are Newton's working papers, which bear traces of his writing process. This kind of document is very useful to establish what is sometimes called the genesis of the text. Here, it is relatively evident that fragments gathered in Yehuda manuscript 15 often present earlier versions of passages more clearly presented or more developed in the Bodmer manuscript. Yet that may also sometimes correspond to later re-elaboration of what is found in the Bodmer manuscript's text. Some efforts have been made by previous readers, mainly the team of editors put up by Catherine Conduitt, to retrieve a narrative or a line of argument from these disparate pages and try to make a sense of the text. Most of the time they failed. Yet some portions may appear as what has been labeled self-contained units. We will see very shortly how the first editors of this manuscript proceeded to achieve this goal and why they could not really do better. For the moment, let's keep in mind that what we are dealing with here is mostly an unarticulated text. This is why, despite its occasional usefulness, it is still difficult or problematic for scholars to rely solely on this manuscript to study Newton's later ventures in ecclesiastical history. It is so even if its complete transcription is currently offered by the Newton Project website. Sometimes decontextualized readings of these fragments may even result in the misinterpretation of their content, which is why a fuller editorial work seems to be needed. As Yehuda manuscript 15, the Bodmer manuscripts also consist of loose bifolios, forming 456 folios in total, more than 900 pages, which is 2 times more than its counterpart. It is indeed a voluminous collection. In its current configuration, the Bodmer manuscript is divided in 16 labeled bundles. This classification was conducted at some point between 1936 and 1949, before its acquisition by Martin Bodmer, who himself did not intervene on the manuscript. What Yehuda transmitted to Martin Bodmer was a much more polished and elaborated version of the material he kept from himself. Here another example of what you can find in a Bodmer manuscript. Indeed, the succession of labeled bundles prepared for that occasion conveyed a reassuring impression of control over the material enclosed therein. Their titles, the titles of the bundles, go as follows. So here on the left side in red, you have in Roman numbers the number of every 16 bundles of the Bodmer manuscript. In bold character, you'll find chapter numbers. We will see to what they correspond in a moment. And then the title of every bundle, which also corresponds to something that we will find in the manuscript. Obviously, this order that you can see here is not the exact order. Sorry, I will just say a few words about the chapter titles. You will notice in these chapter titles, like, for example, here on bundle 2, chapter 1, of the host of heaven and the priest of the host. Or later on, for example, in bundle 6, chapter 4a, of the working of the mystery of iniquity. Or even later on bundle 14, chapter 14, of the abomination of desolation, you will notice some unusual expressions. There are very clear indications that Newton's church history is, if not deeply rooted in, at least guided by his exegesis of the biblical text, mainly the prophetic books of Daniel and of the Revelation. It is even more important to notice that this order is precisely the order Sykes managed to establish when he worked on that material, as is reflected on the table of content written in his hand and placed at the beginning of the Bodmer manuscript, which you'll find here. So it's pretty interesting here to see the correspondence between the title of the bundles and this table of content written in Sykes' hand. You see the correspondence immediately. For example, here, if you see the entry under number 3 of the face once delivered to the saint, you'll see that in bundle 4, chapter 3, you recognize of the face once delivered to the saint. So the chapter titles that I put in bold characters correspond, all of them, to the table of content established by Sykes at the beginning of the manuscript. It's important to keep that in mind. Obviously, this is not the exact order Newton had in mind when he wrote these pages, or when he last worked on them, since he drafted several tables of content himself, all of which directly contradict the current sequence of chapters. Here you have an example of a table of content written in the hand of Newton. So you see that they contradict themselves, but also that they contradict Sykes' table of content and today's configuration of the treatise. Newton seems to never have reached satisfaction in putting his work into order, which already tells us a lot about how he worked on this matter. That is, without a pre-established plan. So it seems safe to assume that the Bodmer manuscript, in its current configuration, is partly the result of Newton's writing. Of course, it is the most important part, but also partly the result of Sykes' editorial work, which results in this order. As such, even if it is for different reasons, one has to be as cautious about it as one is when dealing with the Yehuda manuscript 50. Also, I have to state here that despite its greater readability, the Bodmer manuscript may sometimes appear as confusing as Yehuda manuscript 15 when one reads it from beginning to end. What blurs the line here somehow is the fact that Sykes chose to place alternative versions right next to the text he managed to establish for every chapter. This is confusing to the point that, at first sight, some folders may seem to contain several different chapters, while in fact they are just different versions of the same one. This can be evident, for example, in bundle 7 here, where you have different chapter headings included or juxtaposed one next to the other. So of the host of heaven and the corruption which crept into it is juxtaposed to of the disputable opinions which crept into the religion of the primitive church. So of course, when you read this manuscript from beginning to end, you have this misleading impression that it's not consistent, that it's repetitive to a point that it does not make sense. But yet, this is not the case. We will see in a moment why. I should also state here that the great advantage of the scheme adopted by Sykes is that it seems to follow a chronological order, more or less. We will come back to that in a moment, but for now, let's investigate how he managed to achieve the task assigned to him by Newton's thesis, and which methods he had at his disposal to do so. So here I will switch, if you don't mind, to another. Yes. Tadeusz, can you confirm that we changed views? Yes, okay. Thank you. One method immediately employed to put some order into the vast amount of loose papers Newton left behind him was to rely on his system of catchwords. Catchword refers here to words that Newton used to inscribe on the bottom margin at the right corner of a page to announce the following word on the next one. This is particularly useful when you need to ensure that the junction between two otherwise loose bifolios is maintained, as in the example here from the Bodmer manuscript we will see. Just a few pages later, okay. I will zoom in a little bit to show you what I'm talking about. Okay. So here you see, for example, the word charity is a catchword, which you will see repeated here at the top of the next page. Of course, when it's inside the same bifolio, it's not difficult, but sometimes you will have a catchword as here. The primitive church continued uncorrupted, but we here reach the end of the bifolio, and you have to find the corresponding catchword in another, a new bifolio, which is why it is important to maintain this chain of catchwords. Now, it was John Conduitt, Catherine's husband, who took upon himself to make sure that the correct succession of catchwords remained as preserved as possible. Yet, as I already mentioned, Newton's working archives consisted mainly in dispersed papers, which resulted in the fact that the chain of catchwords was already broken in many places when Conduitt started to work on them. You can see Conduitt at work in the pencil notes he left at the back of the bifolio that could potentially have a missing. So here, for example, in that case, you have the catchword uncorrupted. Here, inscribed in Conduitt's hand at the back of the bifolio, to look for this word in another one, which he finally did here, and which permit to maintain the unity of the text. He kept also track of his early efforts on a separate working paper that was transmitted to Sykes with the manuscript. And here I want to show you this, which is Conduitt working paper. We see Conduitt hand here in ink. And under number 5, here are listed all the missing links, all the catchwords he had to look for in the Bodmer manuscript and the manuscript related to it. So here, for example, if you see the little hand that's moving on the image, you will recognize the catchword uncorrupted with the cross right next to. So Conduitt kept track of his work on the catchword for many, many manuscripts, as you can see here. Under number 5, as I just mentioned, are the catchwords which interest us above all. Conduitt achieved remarkable success in applying this method to the Bodmer manuscript, which shows a relatively low number of textual gaps and discontinuities compared to other manuscripts, as Yehuda manuscript 15, for example. Now, as is shown from the following example, when dealing with catchwords, it is sometimes possible to face a multiple choice scenario, where a single ending catchword may correspond to different instances of the same first word or incipit on the next page. Here I will return to the Bodmer manuscript to show you what I am talking about. Okay, let's take this for instance. So here we are in the Bodmer manuscript at the end of a bifolio, and you recognize the now usual catchword at the right-hand corner, put. Now you see that the junction has been made. Here is the next bifolio, which maintain a textual unity, apparently. But this was not the only choice Conduitt had. For example, the very first folio of Yehuda manuscript 15 starts in the same manner, with the exact same sentence. So let me go back here to catchword put, because it was simply put by the father. Here in another manuscript, the manuscript, Yehuda manuscript 15, you have this instant of the same incipit, but you also have it later in Yehuda manuscript 15. Here, for example, you recognize the exact same incipit. Or even 2 pages later, here, again. So when confronted to that situation, Conduitt, or maybe also Sykes after him, did the best he or they could to induce a solution from the rest of the text. This worked most of the time, but it could also lead to misleading results. And here we'll have an example of one in the Bodmer manuscript. at folio 48 recto. There we go. So here you have, as usual, page, the end of a bifolio, and the last sentence, one of those creeds, Eusebius of Caesarea, presented to the council, next page, next bifolio, council of Nice, testifying that he received it from his ancestors and was baptized into it. Now, the textual continuity seems preserved here, but in fact, more than 15 years separate these two segments that were put together by the same catchword. Another matching segments in the Bodmer manuscript seems much more in line with what precedes. And it is this one, which is situated hundreds and hundreds of pages later in the Bodmer manuscript. Here we go. Same incipit, but a better match, as is also confirmed, and this is important, by the watermark analysis. I'll come back to that in a moment. To get a better idea of the work done by Conduitt, it seems worthy to have a look at the database that I built from this manuscript, which also records all the catchwords from Bodmer manuscript and Yehuda manuscript 15. And here I will switch to my database. Can you confirm that the image has changed, please? Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So here is the database I built from those manuscripts. And I'd like to point to these two columns here, which record the incipits of every folio, and this column right next to it, which records every catchword of every folio. So here in green is indicated the textual continuity of the manuscript. That is, when catchwords, when the chain of catchwords has been preserved. And you will see here we are in the second bundle of the Bodmer manuscript that we have quite a consistent text. It shows here with these green cells. The yellow cells, on the contrary, indicate when there is a rupture in the catchwords chain. So we have here quite a well-preserved unit. And then, as I mentioned earlier, added to that, some alternative version of the text Sykes managed to get together at first. And it goes like this also for all the bundles of the Bodmer manuscript. I will now go down to give you an idea of how consistent this text is. You will see how all these cells are green here. In red, I've indicated every case where a catchword is also found in other manuscripts, in other bifolios, which led to this multiple choice scenario I was mentioning a minute ago. So here also a beautiful textual continuity. And here in black indicates that we now go to the alternate version of the text that precedes, and another alternate version of the text. So sometimes in one bundle, you will have 2, 3, maybe 4 versions of the same chapter, which is why a continuous reading is problematic, and which is why we have to follow Sykes' indication of his editorial work. So you see all these bundles are quite consistent, this also. And when we arrive to the last 2 bundles, which contains drafts, which contains chapters that were not included by Sykes in the whole work, you will notice that the textual continuity starts to get much more problematic. Okay, here we go. Bundle 15. Here we have something that is much less coherent, much less consistent. Not to speak about the end of the Bodmer manuscript. Okay. Now, sorry. Now it's possible to compare this feature to Yehuda manuscript 15. And here we will do the same with a very consistent part at the very beginning of Yehuda manuscript 15, still an incipit, which is part of a multiple choice. But then as we go in the manuscript, we'll see that it is much less consistent than the bottom manuscript. Still, we have some chunks here that make sense, but it is quite difficult. And the comparison, I think, is quite eloquent between these two. So this database, among many other things, as we shall see, allows us to assess the textual continuity of the manuscripts that resulted from the efforts of Newton's early editors, as well as from later handlings. Let's compare Yehuda manuscript 15 with the Bodmer manuscript. Clearly, one is much more coherent than the other. From there, given the strong interdependence already noted between these two, one might ask if the Bodmer manuscript could not be used as a key, that is, as a standard text from which to reorder Yehuda manuscript 15, as well as other disorganized manuscripts directly linked to it. Since it is the manuscript that shows the most achieved form of textual continuity, I think it could help to at least rearrange the content of Yehuda manuscript 15 according to the different chapters of the Bodmer manuscript they correspond to, which I did virtually in another database. But let's go back to Sykes. How did he work towards his reconstruction of Newton's treatise? As I already said, he could and he did rely on John Conduitt's initial work on catchwords. Yet, this fundamental work was conducted at a microscopic scale, so to speak. It did not really require going through an extensive reading of the content of every page of the manuscript, nor to have any clear idea of the whole architecture of the treatise, since a simple identification of junction points would have been sufficient. Conduitt apparently did not try to act so much at a structural level, deciding which chapter should come after the other, or at least he did not leave so many traces of it. As is now clear, this task was ultimately left to Arthur Ashley Sykes. Here are some examples of his intervention on the manuscripts. Here you have an indication by Sykes. This chapter is almost transcribed. With an indication, sorry, I will zoom in a little bit. Almost transcribed, some in the first, some in the second, third, fourth, fifth chapters, so that this seems to be the first draft, then enlarged and drawn out in those chapters. So it's quite interesting here to see that Sykes is able to determine which passage came before the other, which one is an enlargement of the other. And on the next image, we have also a very interesting indication on his end, in his handwriting. You see. printed from the hand, that is the manacle that he put in the manuscript, in page 5 to the end in page 15, and makes up the chapter 8 in the prophecies of Daniel, but should be reprinted. There are many of those interventions. I will not show all of them to you today, but they can be summed up as: 1, collating text with works already published, mainly the chronology and the observation. 2, identifying duplicates or textual redundancies within and between different chapters. 3, identifying different stages in the composition of the treatise. 4, establishing a chronological plan for the text. 5, eliminating parts that were too, I quote, imperfect to be integrated to the final product, which resulted in the last 2 bundles of the bottom manuscript, and probably also in the entirety of Yehuda manuscript 50. On that regard, eliminating imperfect part of duplicates may have been at some point the most visible evidence of editorial intervention of the manuscript. And this evidence is today almost invisible. And as such, it has been so far completely overlooked by scholars. And here I speak about the systematic folding of bifolios considered by Sykes to be rejected. As here is indicated, again in his hand, the folded sheets are transcribed into the chapter and therefore of no use. This most important part of early editorial work on the Bodmer manuscript and on Yehuda manuscript 15 was deliberately suppressed afterwards, maybe for select purposes. These bifolios were indeed systematically unfolded, which did almost completely erase editorial choices previously made and paradoxically rendered these materials less readable by multiplying the options available to the reader. Fortunately, the systematic folding of these pages is now recorded in the database I showed you. This is an example of why one cannot rely on images of manuscript alone, but one must see, touch, and manipulate papers in archives. Yes, I see Stefan Litt, you would like to intervene? I see you have a hand up.
No, that was just my remark that I'm interested to ask a question afterwards. Please go on.
Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. Here I should also say a word about 88 numbered pages Sykes often refers to in his remark. So here is, in another hand, the mention of this, as you see here, 88 pages, which we still don't know who, paged. You'll see them again here. Above Sykes' draft of his table of content, we saw the definitive version earlier. This is the draft on the other side of the sheet, where Sykes inscribed his table of content. And here you will have again this mention of 88 pages. So these 88 pages correspond to a set of pages assembled by someone else, maybe Thomas Parker, first Earl of Macclesfield, perhaps with the help of maybe also Bishop Sherlock, at some point before Sykes started to work on the whole lot. And I think even before Catherine Conduitt wrote her Codicil. Since here you have in Conduitt's hand the mention showed to the Queen, and it could be an indication that the 88 pages that were included in this folder were at some point showed to the Queen before Conduitt died in 1737. So that is before Catherine wrote her the Codicil to her will, which mentions a church history complete. So it is possible that this set of complete 88 pages, which are numbered and which you can find in the whole jungle of the Bodmer manuscript, it is possible that this set of complete 88 pages was in fact what Catherine was referring to as a church history complete, along with a history of the creed, which she mentioned also in her will, which would now form the first chapters of the Bodmer manuscript. Yet it is evident from the tables of content alone that Newton's project was much more developed than these 88 pages, which is why Sykes did extend the scope of his editorial intervention beyond this initial set. They resulted in the current configuration of the Bodmer manuscript, which follows a chronological order that can be and has been difficult to identify due to the aforementioned numerous repetitions and rewriting that punctuate the main development. However, I think we can say Sykes did a pretty good job in putting all this material together. To sum up, the whole set can be divided in three main thematic units, which correspond to three consecutive historical stages in the early development of Christianity. And here I think it's time to have a look at the content of this treatise. I will read now a sum up of these 1,000 pages. So please keep in mind that it is very rough, a very rough sum up. The first stage, the primitive stage. In chapter 1 of the host of heaven and the prince of the host, Newton explores the meaning behind the terms found in Daniel chapter 8. He sees the host of heaven as the original pure church, which is with its simple beliefs and unity among Jews and Gentiles who stood against outside corruption. Newton believes that Jesus is the prince of the host mentioned by Daniel. In chapter 2 of the Holy Covenant, Newton delves into the agreement between God and his people to maintain their simple faith in God, Christ, and love for one another. He distinguishes between the basic doctrines for all believers, referred to as milk for babes, and more advanced theological studies meant only for advanced scholars, known as meat for men of full age. Newton emphasizes the importance of not arguing about these complex topics and avoiding outside, that is, philosophical or metaphysical, influences to maintain unity in this simple primitive creed. In chapter 3 of the Faith Once Delivered to the Saint, Newton covers the original creed that was passed down from Hebrew orally. He again highlights the harm that occurs when this creed becomes distorted and the meat for men of full age infects the milk for babes. Here I will quote Newton when he writes what this primitive creed is. It was only to repent from dead works, to love and glorify God for creating all things, and Christ for redeeming us with his blood, to pray to God in the name of Christ, to love our neighbors ourselves, and to live quietly under government. This is quotation from Bodmer manuscript, folio 68, recto. The second stage, the corruption stage. The next historical step is explored in chapter 4 of the theology of the heavens, Kabbalists, and ancient heretics. In this significant chapter, Newton posits that the contamination of the pure church in the early Christian era happened when converts from paganism and Judaism infused their metaphysical beliefs into Christianity. He argues that Platonic philosophy and Kabbalah were particularly insidious, and their teachings of God's emanation can be seen in the creed, corrupting it and bringing harm to the Christian religion. Newton states that the Gnostics, who were essentially converted Jews, brought Kabbalah with them and overthrew the true faith. In chapter 5, Newton examines the intrusion of foreign metaphysics again, offering a more in-depth historical views of its progression during the reigns of various Roman emperors. This chapter is less theoretical than the precedent one, more historical in its account. He reiterates the unity and peace among early Christians before they were divided by arguments about faith due to the influence of metaphysics on the creed. During those better times, Jewish Christians, the circumcised Christians, could coexist harmoniously with Gentile Christians, the uncircumcised Christians, who were not required to follow the law. However, the situation started to deteriorate after the time of Justin Marc. In chapter 6, a further account of the host of heaven, the corruption which crept into it, Newton continues to cover these themes, but also examines how decisions were made by early church councils, which institutionalized the mistakes of converted metaphysicians. In chapter 7 of the Christian religion, corruption in morals, and chapter 8 of the corruption of the church in language and opinions, Newton delves further into the history of church corruption. He argues that the most dangerous corruption was the transformation of metaphysical emanation theories into Trinitarianism, a concept that he stresses was not at all part of the primitive creed, and which tragically became a dogma with the rise of the church father Athanasius of Alexandria in the 4th century. Chapter 9 and 10 can be seen as transitional chapter. In them, Newton provides a comprehensive examination of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem and in its administration. He argues that the early Christian church was modeled after the governance of the temple and synagogues. However, the original structure, beliefs, and unity of the church were lost when the Bishop of Rome rose to prominence and gained supreme power without proper authorization. And now we enter the third post-corruption stage, the rise of the Catholic Church. In chapter 11, 12, and 13, titled The Roman Empire and its Ecclesiastical Dominion, the rise and dominion of the Catholic Church and of the abomination of desolation, Newton explores the rise of the Church of Rome as a result of its compromise with theological heresies and division in whole Christianity during the 4th century. In his perspective, and that of many others during his time, the Pope was synonymous with the mystery of iniquity mentioned in the book of Daniel. Newton explains how popes Damasus, Valens, and Valentinian engaged in political struggles for control of the entire church, and when they failed, they caused the division of the Western and Eastern empires. Despite claiming to be against heresy, Newton argues that the popes actually promoted it within the church. In the final and last chapter, 14, the abomination of desolation, he examines specific examples of the abuses of the Roman Church, some of which were the result of misguided metaphysical beliefs, and others that were heathen practices that the Church adopted. Newton describes the development of these practices, such as the idolatrous invocation of saints and the adoration of relics. A few remarks now. Newton had already tackled what is now the third section of this treatise in an earlier work on church history written in Latin between 1675 and 1695, which is now available in the scholarly edition and Spanish translation by Dr. Toribio Perez. This version of the one that we have now in the modern manuscript, this version of the third stage in the history of the church is a significant revision of his previous views on the topic, which were leaning towards Arianism at the time. The first part of the treatise, which could be the history of the creed and or criticism of it, Catherine mentioned in a will, represents a significant advancement in his historical theological writings. They are quite new stuff. The second part of the treatise, the central one, appears to be the application of certain concepts from his earlier work on ancient religion, titled Theologia Gentilis Origines Philosophicae, which is Yehuda manuscript 15, applied, as I was saying, to Christian heresies. This manuscript was discussed by Scott Mondergoat in the previous talk. So it is important to note that the current form of this treatise was not originally written in a specific order or following a set structure, it was later organized chronologically by Sykes, not by Newton himself, as evidenced by his own notes and table of contents draft, which suggests that he was indecisive about whether to approach these matters in a chronological or a thematical matter, or a thematic, matter. This creates many difficulties and raises questions about the possibility of uncovering an original version of what Newton had in mind. In my opinion, he himself did not come to a conclusion on this matter and eventually gave up. Therefore, I do not believe that it is productive to try to find a solution to a problem that he was unable or unwilling to solve himself. Instead, I suggest continuing to work with Sykes' version of the treatise as long as it is acknowledged as such, with all the caveats that entails. I will now enter the final part of my talk, and I'll try to move forward a little bit faster. Sorry about it. What does it exactly mean to continue working on that version, you may ask? What more can be done about this text that Sykes would have not already achieved? And perhaps more importantly, what more can we learn from it? I think the central question here, which despite numerous attempts by Newton scholars remains unanswered so far, is the question of the dating of this manuscript. Determining date ranges for the manuscript assembled in the Bodmer and Yehuda manuscript 15 would allow us to contextualize Newton's work on church history and better understand its relationship to other works, whether by Newton himself or his contemporaries. You will have noticed that I have carefully avoided to approach this subject until now. That is because the dating of such a large and diversified collection of manuscripts is something very difficult to assess without relying on material evidence on the one hand, and as we shall see, digital technologies on the other. As for material evidence, for instance, sheets from Yehuda manuscript 15 have been identified in the catalogue of the Newton project as, I quote, having previously been used for material concerning Newton's activities at the Mint and in the Royal Society. The text on folio 124 is written around some jottings about payments, probably Mint related, made in 1708 or 1709. This is what you see now on the screen. So you will see here at the center some dates inscribed. There are also other examples of this kind of documents, but not so many of them. I don't think there are more than 10 in the whole set. So that's about all that we can get. There is even less hard evidence in the Bodmer manuscript that would link a passage to a particular date. Even if you find there some drafts clearly relating to Newton's office at the Mint, as this one, for example, where you can see a few sentences about the Council of Alexandria mixed with remarks about Cornwall, about the price of tin in Cornwall. Without any precise date, the time span covered by this Mint document is way too large to be relevant. We have seen during our last talk that Newton's recourse to published source could sometimes provide some help in the dating of such and such passage. But here again, this does not prove sufficient, especially on such a large corpus. Vagueness in the dating of the manuscripts has led Newton scholars to disagree on their relationship to other works from Newton, especially his most commented text, the General Scholium, in addition to the Principia Mathematica published in the second edition of 1730. Conflicting statements about supposed influence of contemporaries, here I think about Samuel Clarke or Jean Leclerc, also derived from inaccuracies in the dating of these papers. So in the final part of this presentation, we will have a look at new research methods recently applied to this material, and I will eventually present some of their results. In my view, the two most promising techniques used to further study the complex corpus of Newton's theological papers are 1, the watermark analysis, and 2, latent semantic analysis. For the time being, I will focus mainly on watermark analysis, which gave the lecture series its title, and I will leave for another occasion the part about latent semantic analysis. However, I can already direct you to the Chemistry of Isaac Newton website, where first results of latent semantic analysis applied to Newton's alchemical corpus are currently available. The general approach developed by the Newton Watermark project will be discussed in more detail during our next talk. Today, I'm just going to show you how it was applied to that specific corpus of Newton's church history. Here are the steps I took. First step was to obtain, I'm trying to reduce the image here, yes, backlit images of all the watermarks in the corpus. Then I had to provide description of these watermarks, including class names and dimensions. Here we used Alan Shapiro's labeling system for watermark classes, which proved very effective. Then I had to enter the watermark information in the database I showed you earlier in order to produce overviews of the results to facilitate cross-analysis between different manuscripts and within each manuscript as well. So that results in this kind of data visualization, which we'll try to navigate here together a little bit. Okay. So here on the right side, you'll have listed all the different watermark classes that would have been employed in the manuscript related to Newton's Church History Complete. That is mainly the Bodmer manuscript, Yehuda manuscript 15, and also several different scattered manuscripts. I will not go too much into detail here. Just to show you that this overview already shows some general trends. For example, here are represented the different watermark classes, and you will see that some of them clearly dominate the rest. The green one here refers to a particular watermark, which has as a countermount the initials AR, and as a main watermark, the arms, a certain type of arms. Here, for example, another important watermark that was used is the combination of countermark IV for the initials of the paper maker facing the arms of London in a large version of that, which is coded here DAG because they show a little DAG. So this type of visualization help us show which watermarks dominate the corpus. They can also help us show, as here, how they are distributed within the manuscripts. Some, like here, the mainstream that you will see, are very widely distributed among the different bundles of the Bodmer manuscript in that case. Some, on the contrary, are very restricted in their use, like this one, for example. When you follow the stream, you'll see that it's mainly used in this one, in this bundle, and partially in another. But there are real differences in the use of the watermarks and in their distribution within the manuscript. Some are widely distributed. Some are only found in one bundle. Consequently, and I will move forward here, we can address the question of which part of the treatise seems to be the most consistent in that regard. I mean, regarding the use of watermarks. Inversely, we can also show which parts are less consistent. So here I will show you, for example, some parts related to bundle number 6 of the Bodmer manuscript. You will see that you will have big chunks of the same watermarks. And you will note here that this watermark is shared between Bodmer manuscript and Yehuda manuscript 15. In other parts, next bundle, you will also have a big chunk of continuous use of the same watermark, this time also scattered between different manuscripts. So you have the Bodmer manuscript, you have manuscript, Yehuda manuscript 15 here, and here you will have some drafts related to the general scholium, which I was mentioning earlier. So it's also quite useful to see which bundles are made of different types of paper, because these watermarks, as we will see in a minute, can be dated, or at least we can obtain a date ranges for most of them. So you will have some parts which will appear to have been written in the same at the same period between different bundles, and some part within a single bundle or within a single chapter, which would have years separating them. So to sum up, these charts help us identify large tendencies within the corpus, trends, but also anomalies, like the one I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, when Conduitt took the wrong turn in identifying which bifolio was corresponding to a single catchwords. And I mentioned that 15 years separated 2 pages here because it chose to put after the bifolio which had a missing link, a bifolio which was a watermark antedate from 15 years, the correct version of the text he would have chosen had he knew it. As to what regards the dating of the corpus in general, it seemed to me the best way to date the watermarks, and from there the pages where they were found, was to determine a terminus postquem, a date after which they were used by Newton, and a terminus antequem, a date before which they were used by Newton, for each class of watermarks found in both the dated correspondence of Isaac Newton, as well as in the Bodmer manuscript, Yehuda manuscript 15, and a few other related manuscripts. This had been established from the earliest and latest occurrences of a class of watermarks within the correspondence set, which was used because of its dated letters as a benchmark based on the dating, as I was saying, of the letters. Results are here presented in a chronological order. So here you have some code watermark classes with the corresponding date ranges in the correspondence set. And this is from there that we are able to determine date ranges from parts of this manuscript.
Mark, I'm sorry, we have 5 minutes.
Okay, I will. Oh gosh, I will make quick. Sorry.
Okay.
It may be important to notice here that I did not find any significant jump in the use of these watermarks within the correspondence that would, for instance, occur between letters written more than 10 years apart. One should also notice that some watermarks appeared during a single year only in Newton's correspondence, which is the case here, for example, in an important watermark class, CHG DAG, which appears many times in our set, and which has only been used during 1 year by Newton in his correspondence. So yes, let me just move forward and let's go to our conclusion. the next stage was to merge this data in a way that would help us apprehend an estimated dating of the whole treatise according to the density of occurrences of watermarks across time. It took some time to figure out, but I think we may have found a satisfactory way to do so by projecting the terminus postquem on the x-axis and the terminus antequem here on the y-axis of a Cartesian coordinate system in order to produce a contour plot chart that would let us visualize combined date ranges and density of occurrences at the same time. You will find these results here in this chart. So from here, you have represented the density in usage of such and such watermark according to different timelines, that is date ranges. So you can, for example, see that part of the treatise were written in the 1690s. Then you have another writing episode here in beginning of 18th century. Then a few years later, and most of the activity here is concentrated around the year that goes from 1707 to 1714. So let's go let's cut here and go to the conclusion, since I don't have much time left. The dating of the pages that makes up Sykes' version of a church history complete by Newton is a game changer for our comprehension of this treatise. Indeed, we now have the ability to analyze its components with greater accuracy, such as identifying the oldest passages of the treatise found in both manuscript bundles 3, 9, and 14, for example. We can also examine sections that were written at a later time. And we can ask the question, is there a clear boundary between the themes covered in the earliest and most recent portions of the treatise? Based on the dating of the watermarks, it becomes evident that the core theme of the work, which is the depiction of the corruption that took place in the early church, is primarily found in the most recent material, which will be situated here. Conversely, earlier material addresses topics peripheral to that central matter, such as the depiction of the pure primitive church and the systematic examination of ancient creeds at one end, as well as the Catholic Church post-corruption at the other. So here we are talking about passages that are located in this time span. Regarding Yehuda manuscript 15, the dating of its various parts sheds a new light on its importance for scholarship. For example, a significant draft dated 1708 and dated as such because its watermark was only used that year by Newton, described Newton's God as Pantokrator in Greek, in terms very similar to those found in the General Scholium of 1730, which we now know was written about 5 years later. Similarly, Yehuda manuscript 15, folio 158, contains the draft of a table of contents on a piece of paper that can now be dated between 1694 and 1696 due to its watermark. This draft not only confirms that the project was based on Newton's interpretation of Daniel's prophecies, as already evidenced by the use of biblical terms in the chapter heading, but it also offers insight into how the project might have developed over time, as it is the earliest draft of a table of contents on this subject. In conclusion, and I will stop here, I promise, I would like to pose a question that arises directly from the dating of these pages. Previously, scholars have primarily been curious about what prompted Newton's renewal of interest in the corruption of the church during his later years. with the new information on the dating of these pages, we can now approach the question from a different perspective and ask instead, why did he cease work on this treatise after the mid-1710s? That means after the year that would go from that location. Given that so little progress was made after 1716 and 1770. That would be situated here on the right-hand corner of that chart. Why did he stop there? Is the question I would like to address as a conclusion to this talk. And I would stop now and apologize for the time it all took. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. No worries, because I have to sometimes be a bad policeman. So Ji Song was asking before, I mean, it was 30 minutes ago, I'm sorry. Could you please repeat the bishop's name you were mentioning before?
Bishop Sherlock.
Okay, Bishop Sherlock. Is there anyone who would like to ask the question, and then I will be able to unmute you, and maybe it will be easier. Please raise your hand in that case, and I will unmute you. Yeah, we have one Scott. Okay. Scott, you can speak.
Mark, one thing that I think would be interesting would be to consider take a bit further your comment that the previous editing by Conduitt and his team of editors of Newton's chronology and of the book that's published as Observations on the Prophecies has an impact on the creation or difficulties with the creation of this text.
Yes, thank you, because of course, manuscripts that were used for this publication were taken off the whole lot. And so it's interesting that part of the manuscript related to this treatise of the church are textually related, quotes manuscripts that were published by Conduitt and his teammates in these two books. So it took out part of the whole lot that maybe could have been used differently by Sykes when he worked on that set.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone? Okay, Ji Song would like to. I also unmute you. Ji, I need to promote you to be a panelist, so I will do it right now. And wait a second. Please accept, and I will unmute you once you agree. Okay. Please speak.
Thank you, Mark, for such a meticulous report. Really, it's a foundational work, obviously. But the just following Scott's question on prophecies. Now, Newton was following, as I understand it, a not yet standard position on the issue of the restoration of Israel, as he was well aware of Joseph Meade's of Christ Church. But this made me think that perhaps he rekindled his interest in church history. Might it have anything to do with his interest in prophecies?
Yes, absolutely. And this is something that Scott Mondelboot has already shown in the past. That is that his historical works are clearly linked to his exegesis of Daniel, among others, but mainly linked to Daniel. He reads these prophecies as something that announces what is going to happen in history and has already happened by his time. So, of course, it is important to link historic endeavors by Newton to his close reading of biblical text, and mainly Daniel and the Revelation. That shows, of course, in the titles of the chapters that he chose.
Thank you.
And also, if I may, here interject, it also shows in the watermarks that are shared between manuscript use for commenting on Daniel and manuscript use for writing his history of the church. So some of them are very contemporaneous.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned a few times to the Newton project. I read some of their works with particular reference to Newton's research and exegetical work on the restoration of Israel. Now, did you come across his relationship with other contemporary philosophers and thinkers and theologians, including Mr. Locke, who was trying to understand the letter to the Romans? Now, obviously, Romans 9 to 11 is such a concentrated 3 chapters relating to the past, present, and future of the nation of Israel. Do you have any comments on this?
Yes, it's a more general comment about the question of influences on or influences of Isaac Newton. I mean, he certainly did work with close friends that were theologians. I think here in particular of Samuel Clarke. And of course, he had a correspondence with Locke. But I mean, it is very difficult to state who influenced whom in that case, especially if you don't have a chronology in the evolution of his thought.
Particularly if we don't have their private diaries and journals.
Yes, but here again, watermark analysis might provide some help in a sense that I said a few words about Newton's god Pantocrator, Lord of Dominion, that is mentioned in the General Scholium. Well, by analyzing watermarks, you might find some pages which date back to the 1690s, between 1694 and 1696, which already mention God as a Pantocrator. So that is many, many years before he started to even think about the General Scholium. And I think this is something that wasn't known until we were able to date or to provide some date ranges for these pages.
But perhaps Newton and his closest follower, I mean, William Winston was, I think, was branded heretical in his theological view. But I mean, would you agree that Newton and his close circles was a minority within the Anglican Church of the time?
Yes, there certainly were a minority, and this may explain why, in the end, these pages were not published. Samuel Clarke, who defended a vision of Trinity really similar to what Newton writes in this manuscript, was attacked for it. Whiston, of course, was punished for it. But yes, this cycle, a cycle of which Sykes, which ultimately is Newton's editor, was part of. He defended Samuel Clarke in his publication of 1718, and he was the preacher at Newton's church. So yes, it's right to speak about a cycle. I think Newton was part of that cycle, and he worked as a member of that cycle.
Thank you, Mark. Would you say, would you see Newton as one of the original, as the founders, or so to speak, okay, of the deist movement, which later emerged? And furthermore, did Newton have anything to do with the later emergence of this Trinitarian thinking within the Anglican Church?
Oh, that's a question I'm afraid I'm not able to answer to. I mean, these manuscripts, as I showed at the very start of my talk, were kept away from public until 1936. So it's difficult to speak about Newton's influence on the larger public without him publishing his thoughts or having his thoughts known among the general public.
Indeed.
But that does not mean that he did not have any influence on others. He certainly did have an influence on Sykes, for example.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone who would like to ask the question? Okay, I see no more questions. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. By the way, we accept those questions, Mark. We had a few nice comments, people saying thank you very much for this wonderful and deep presentation. So thank you again on behalf of everyone. And see you very much. And see you next month. Have a good evening.
Thank you.